All right, good day, HSM 302 students. Um, as I've communicated to the class, we are going to be having Unit 2 and Unit 3 recorded for your viewing and your learning convenience, primarily because of the disruption that has been caused with the electricity. I know that some students have also been affected by striking at their residence. So that we don't get left behind, I thought that it would be appropriate for us to record this. Now, Unit 2 deals with the international conventions and public participation in housing and human settlements development. This lecture series is about 80 slides long, so I might break it up into part one and part two, but send it off as a package to you because I want to keep each video at about 20 to 30 minutes each so that you're able to follow and that they're not too fast-paced. So I think let's go straight into it. I'll just switch off my video so that you are not distracted, or rather, let me just probably just keep my video on, to be quite honest. Right. So the learning outcomes at the end of this lecture is that the students, you're supposed to be empowered with the knowledge of critical citizenship, very important concept, public participation and community involvement in development management within the human settlement space, gaining a deeper appreciation of the policies and legislation for public participation in the South African context. And I also need you to have comprehended clearly the mechanisms and the shortcomings of public participation in human settlements development, and acquire a sound understanding of social facilitation. So we're dealing in the first unit with definitional issues. We're now going into an important part, which is the policies and the public social facilitation within housing and human settlements development. All right, so our first point of entry is that these are really some of the concepts to learn. I won't go into them much, but you can pause this slide and you'll be able to pick up on key definitional issues that some of which we dealt with extensively in Unit 1 over that two lecture week series. But for the purpose of time, I want you to pause this and go quite meaningfully on the concepts, not just the definitions, but the concepts themselves for you to learn. All right, so what we'll be dealing with in this lecture is the global practices, which is the UN Habitat Conventions and the Sustainable Development Goals, the Nelson Mandela University Community Engagement Facility, so that you're able to philosophically ground where our uh, uh, discourse or our point of departure is. And then we'll unpack community participation, mechanisms for public participation within the human settlements development space, shortcomings of public participation, and then we'll do a policy and strategy issue. We may do a group task. How I think I'm going to do this group task, however, is we're going to talk about global classroom, which I had mentioned. I think it starts next month in September, but I will walk you through that. But we'll talk about the task that we're going to do. We won't be able to do it now because this is a pre-recorded session, but it's an important part in giving the feedback loop to this lecture series. Now let's talk about the UN Habitat Conventions. So what has the Republic of South Africa committed to in terms of international conventions? The first one, the first meaningful one, is the seminal UN Habitat Global Summit of 1976. That's where the Vancouver Declaration was held in Vancouver in Canada. And really that declaration is where we first start seeing the definition of human settlements as the totality of the human community, whether city, town, or village, with all social, material, organizational, and cultural elements. Now, the three-part that the Vancouver Declaration on Human Settlements focused on was A, the sustainability, which is social, economic, and environmental. So the three legs of sustainability, the physical elements, which is the shelter and the infrastructure that feeds into that human settlements organism, as we spoke about it. And of course, the social amenities, which speak to education, nutrition, religion, culture, and so forth. So the first important story that you want to craft is you want to drag it all the way to 1976 so that you understand in the continuum of where the Republic of South Africa is in terms of its policy formulation for human settlements and its policies thereof, and based on the international commitments that we've made. Now, the UN Conference on the Environment and Development, or the Earth Summit in 1992, the so-called the Rio conference emphasized an integrated approach, where we're talking about integration in our approach, public participation as a key component to environmental and developmental issues, and capacity building to address human settlements and development issues. Now, Chapter 7 of Agenda 21, this was the Rio 1992, it's called Agenda 21, speaks to providing adequate shelter for all. You will note that that first part of Chapter 7 speaks a lot to Section 26 of the Constitution that would follow 4 years later here about a provision of adequate shelter for all. Now, this was all-encompassing in that it talked about the improvement of the human settlement management space, promoting sustainable land use. We talked quite extensively about land use management, promoting the integrated provision, promoting human settlements planning and management in disaster-prone areas, and promoting sustainable construction industry. Importantly, which is the last part, which gives rise to this course that you're doing, and your degree program, is the promotion of human settlement as human resource development and capacity building for human settlements development. Now, to a large extent, this last part about promoting the human resource development and capacity within this space has taken over 30 years in South Africa to sort of find fruition. And you are part of the early pioneers in the Bachelor of Human Settlements Development that are the most purposive steps through the Chair of Human Settlements and the department that we fall under in Nelson Mandela University, that is fulfilling Agenda 21 as was envisioned back in 1992. 4 years later, we had the UN Habitat 2 conference, which happened in June of 1996 in Istanbul. And of course, that was called the Istanbul Declaration. And in its Chapter 7 of Agenda 21, the concept of enabling approach was defined. And it was defined as a partnership, right? Partnership amongst public, private, and community sectors seeking to improve the social, economic, and environmental, so sustainability qualities of human settlements and the living and working environments of all. And particularly, this had a focus on people living in poverty, both in urban and rural areas. So this partnership then was centered around an emphasis on participation, giving participation in the decision-making process of community groups, women specifically, indigenous people, the elderly, and people with disabilities. You will find as the year goes on, and if you had taken the advice from the last lecture, which was to look at the Department of Human Settlements website, that we have so-called designated groups, which is women, child-headed households, people living with disability, the elderly. This is not a new concept, but it's starting to nearly 30 years after the Istanbul Declaration of 1996, find itself in implementation stage, not just in policy in the Eastern Cape government, but in implementation. But this should then show you the long road that policy development takes in coming to fruition. All right. So Habitat 2 resolutions was a reiteration of the Rio Declaration, which is adequate shelter for all, sustainable human settlements development, the addressing the unsustainable consumption and production patterns, cultural diversity, improving living conditions, and the promotion of decentralization, so giving power to local authorities for the implementation of the habitat agenda. Further, it then also spoke to the provision of the creation of adequate infrastructure and public services to rural areas. Uh, Perhaps one of the blind spots is how, when we look at development, we more often than not like to focus on the urban areas. So the Habitat 2 resolutions of Istanbul sought to reverse that and actually take cognizance of rural areas, the promotion of and protection of human rights, access to land and credit to expand supply of affordable housing, the conservation and rehabilitation and maintenance of buildings and monuments. The part about the conservation and rehabilitation of maintaining of buildings and monuments, open spaces, landscapes, is quite important. And there's current research that's taking place in Nelson Mandela University in our degree program. You should remind me of it in the next lecture, and I can guide you towards that. And mobilizing, of course, funding. All of these great ideas fall flat if there's no funding and capacity building in the transfer of technologies, right? So Habitat 3, if you notice the gap between Habitat 2 and Habitat 3 is a 10-year gap between 1996, or actually it's a 20-year gap between 1996 and 2016. Now, Habitat 3 was the conference that took place in Quito in Ecuador. And in between Habitat 2 and Habitat 3, there was the Millennium Development Goals, which were superseded by the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals that we will talk about, but primarily Habitat 3 came up with a new urban agenda, which is sustainable cities and human settlements, which is an evolution from the earlier conference that took place in Vancouver in 1976. So what you will notice is a 40-year period of evolution of sort of getting some things right, but realizing that there's so much opportunities for the improvement and crafting this new post SDA or post 2015 agenda towards the new urban agenda. And the principles there are justice, equity, safety, and resilience in cities. You now start seeing the emergence of resilience as a concept, which is a natural progression of sustainability, spatial, social, and ecological integration of communities, the focus on neighborhood, city, and regional development planning. So in terms of scale, public participation and empowerment, things that we had started speaking about 20 years earlier are now being emphasized in the new urban agenda. So it might be a little bit of a misnomer to call it the new urban agenda, in that elements of this were there in the previous iterations of the Habitat conferences, and hope in citizen and pursuit of universal happiness. This now speaks to a new measure, which is the gross happiness index, which is a new measure of livelihood, rather than measuring it in pure economic terms. All right. So the objectives of Habitat 3 was uh, securing a renewed political commitment for sustainable and urban development, assess accomplishment, right? Which is what have we done in the past 20 years? One of the objectives is what have we done in the past 20 years from Habitat 2, that's not 11, that's Habitat II, Roman numerals, conference, the addressing of poverty and the identification and addressing of new emerging urban challenges. Obviously, in 20 years, there's new challenges that have come about. The acceleration of climate change and the establishment then became what is known as the new urban agenda. Something to reflect on here is about the recognition of Africans as in his position to change. We know that as Africans, and this was Pixlika Isaka Sieme, who more than a century ago was really leading the group of activists and scholars who went over to Europe in efforts to create a liberation movement in this country. And of course, you can go through that quote and pause it, but this sort of instigates a thinking about what we do from the Congo to the Gambia and how a crowded cities sending forth the hum of business and looking for change and victories of peace and so forth. Now, let's forward to the African strategy. So we've looked at the global. Now let's look at the African strategy towards sustainable development. And this is Africa's Agenda 2063. This is a continental strategy to optimize Africa's resources for the benefit of all Africans. And I'll give you a chance to maybe go through this slide and not talk to it, so that you sort of pick up on the shared strategic framework. And of course, the vision of 2063 is a prosperous and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizen and representing a dynamic force in the international arena. Now, the aspirations of Agenda 23 is prosperity, which includes growth and sustainable development, an integrated continent in terms of politics based on ideals of Pan-Africanism and the African Renaissance. If you see the language of the African Renaissance, you recognize, if you are a student of recent history, that this is a theme that the former President Thabo Mbeki took over from President Nelson Mandela, which our university is named after, was a great proponent of the African Renaissance or Renaissance. An Africa based on good governance, democracy, and respect for human rights, justice, and law. Additionally, peace is a thing that comes up quite a lot. Cultural identity, heritage, and specifically that about it being people-driven means that it is grassroots led by communities of public participation at the core of the aspirations of Agenda 2063 and the potential, especially of its women, youth, and caring for its children. So a recognition of designated groups there, unity, resilience, and influence in the global playing field. Now let's look at the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. I'm sure you would have picked up on the SDGs in your earlier studies coming up to third year, but it is worth rehashing it for what we're talking about here, and specifically as it relates to human settlements policies and the implementation thereof. And there are 17 SDGs, from the ending of poverty to the ending of hunger, quality education, reducing inequalities, where all of these are important in their totality and viewed in their totality, our key focus areas when it comes to human settlements is um, SDG 11, which is sustainable cities and communities. Of course, all the others have to play a part in creating that. But for the purpose of human settlements, we center a lot around SDG 11. Now, these are, of course, some of the goals that I will give you a chance to sort of go through, which, as I've said, are sort of beneficial and speak to and speak to what we have and speak to what we have as a focus area, which is SDG or Goal 11. So I'm going to just let you, for a brief few seconds, go through that, and then we continue with the lecture series. All right, and of course, Goal 11, make human settlements and cities resilient to climate change and be environmentally sustainable, a key SDG that impacts the sector that we operate in. Now, this is just going in. So we've moved from the sort of global and African view to what do we currently have, the state of our human settlements in the Nelson Mandela Bay. And this is just a snapshot, and this could be a snapshot that could be taken really in any of our sort of former townships. And you will decide on yourself if all the ideals that we've talked about, how far have we achieved them if you take a snapshot of what is happening in Nelson Mandela Bay? Maybe let's step back a little bit to the Nelson Mandela University philosophy, as of course it relates to teaching and it relates to public engagement. So we have a an intersecting three-legged thrust, which is the social justice and the promotion of social justice as a model, economic development, and public good. So all that we do is in pursuit of social justice, economic development, and public good, and where those intersect is really the heart of our philosophical approach as Nelson Mandela University. And with that, we have community engagement and community development in order to really achieve this ideal. There's two key components, which is engaging with the community for the purpose of development in the community rather than a top-down approach. It is an approach that is grassroots led, where the community leads its own development efforts through partnership and coordination with ourselves as an institution of higher learning. Um, Now, there's several approaches that we have to this. The first one is the assets-based approach, and I implore you to take heed of these approaches. The first approach to both community engagement and community development is looking at the assets, and it moves away from a relationship of dependency, and instead it works with the community, right? The community to identify their own strengths and health needs. This is specific to our advanced primary health care unit in Zanempilo, for example. So using the community to say, what are our strengths? What do we have in terms of capacity, and what are our needs? And using the assets that we have as a way towards community development in the health sector. This was from Sister Shanine Oliveira, which is, of course, reflective of the models that I was talking about just prior. Now, let's talk about development as a whole. Sen notes development in general is concerned with the enhancement of the ability of individuals to shape their lives, while Joe Stiglitz, a US professor, views it as a transformation of society. So moving from a whole traditional ways of thinking and traditional methods of production to more modern ways. So development, then it follows that it must improve people's lives. So it's only development if people lives are improved, and um, surveys regards it as multidimensional. So development cannot take place on just one plane, on one topic, but it has to be multidimensional in nature. Let's look at more of development now. The prior to development taking place in any area, whether it's a community or village or household, the first thing is that data or evidence through a comprehensive assessment of the socio-economic condition needs to be taken place. Gathered through this exercise, it provides the basis for determination of the suitable strategies. So development that is not led, and we'll talk about the um, um, engaging with the community. Remember the asset-based approach is development that will be starved of data or evidence. So you're developing from a place of ignorance, which will always have outcomes that are lacking as to what it is that you want to accomplish. The assessment, of course, should not be limited to just socioeconomics, but it should also profile the local capabilities and assets. Going back to Sister Oliveira's comment, which is in line with the model of Nelson Mandela University, and this appreciates the local capabilities. No place, no matter how it may appear, such as what we have here, no place is without potential or capacity, right? So there are capabilities that they have and there are assets that they have. And that becomes a starting point for the success of any interventions that have a local focus. Of course, another important aspect is about local evidence generation. Um, and this part means that when we generate the evidence using the community itself, we're able to empower the community that whose development we are seeking in the first place. So as I said, or as scholars have said in the past, development is multifaceted in nature, and going into these facets of development, the first component being the comprehensive socio-economic profiling. Here we're talking about um, social services, the physical and economic infrastructure of the place, the natural resources, assets in the community, sources of incomes, and the skills bases. All of this cataloging and collecting of this data should give us demographics and the trends of where it's going. Is this community on an upward trajectory in terms of incomes, on a downward trajectory? Because that then gives us the level of urgency, the level of intervention that is needed. And of course, a review of the local economy's drivers and linkages with urban and regional economy is required. Once we have the raw data, we then link it regionally to say, comparatively, where is this local area that we're looking to develop? Where is it on the continuum of development? Development being a truly sustainable human settlements development, which has jobs, which has health, which has social amenity, which is environmentally sensitive, or is in the extreme end where there's poverty is rife, there's no jobs. All of this is instigated by comprehensive socio-economic profiling. Now, you then take that information and audit the existing infrastructure, like deeply and natural resources, through a profiling exercise. Of course, as I've mentioned, that one of the things that I believe that human settlements practitioners should start doing is really becoming well versed in GIS or Geographic Information System, because what we're dealing with is spatial in nature. Infrastructure is spatial, natural resources are spatial. This may be supported by GIS, remote sensing imagery, spatial data analysis to determine over time the existing infrastructure, access level, and potential gaps. This is what an audit really looks like in the framework of the audit. Now, the next step becomes public participation, or included in that is the public participation, which we will go into now. Here's the big question. Is there a link between service delivery protest and public participation? And if there is, why do you say so? Think about this as an exercise, and I want you to pause it here and write yourself out a one-page. Actually, here's what we're going to do. Write a one-page explanation as to your yes and your no, and this part we'll use as the group. I mean the sort of assignment for Unit 2. And we'll decide when we make it due, but I will hand out marks for this. Is there a link between service delivery protest and public participation? And if there is, why do you say so? So just write a one pager. You can choose to reference it. You can choose not to reference it, reference articles, reference newspaper clippings, whatever you want to reference, but speak to the big question, and let's do a one pager on this, and um, we'll work out the timelines of when to submit it. So I want you to, at the end of this or right now, pause this and start doing that draft of the link between service delivery and protest, whether it exists or not, of course. I think that would be a great exercise for you. Um, Here's some key concepts in public participation or community participation. There's public participation, there's community involvement and consultation, and these are by definition really self-explanatory. There's empowerment of the community, in which the community themselves does a lot of the work. We talked about generating their own data and being part of the audit. Social facilitation, we'll talk about social facilitation. A development that is people-centered, in other words, that looks at people first rather than looks at the outcomes of what you want to achieve. Deepening democracy. We'll talk, this talks to and links to active citizenship. This slide will also form part of a discussion that we'll have in our next physical lecture about community participation, because I think the one part of this is going to be done the way that I'm delivering this lecture, but the other part is really going to be when we have this engagement as a class. Now, maybe let's go into some definitions. Now, community participation is direct, and it involves engagement of ordinary people in the affairs of planning. So planning for a development, for planning for an upgrade of an informal settlement, and the governance of that process, and the overall implementation at local and grassroots levels. That is what community participation is. Now, the overview is that understanding community participation in South Africa, we're going to talk about the understanding of that in its full extent, the identification and understanding of key stakeholders, the understanding the concept of active citizenry, and we'll look at a case study of NMPM on project-based community participation. We may have to pause soon here we may have to pause in about a few minutes to break up, as I said at the beginning. We're going to have two sections of this, two parts of Unit 2. And really then as a first part, of course, the overview. The second part, or the third part, as it's wrongly numbered here, is the involvement of citizens in project identification, planning, implementation, monitoring and evaluating of performance, the empowerment and improvement of living standards, prioritization of vulnerable groups, like I said, children, women, um, all of which takes place in a specific geographic area. Um, well, continuing in the theme of community participation, it should always talk about inclusivity and the power of the community. If it's not inclusive, it can't be fully owned by the community. Collective governance means that if you are doing a project, things like you look at a housing project or a human settlements project, and it's usually rife where theft of concrete, cement, sand, paint is taking place. This is the output of missing this important step of community participation and setting an agenda for social and economic development. That agenda is driven actively by the direct decision makers, which is the community itself as the stakeholders, and is beneficially influenced or beneficially influences the decision makers themselves, who in this case are also the stakeholders. Now, the rationale for community participation is it provides a sense of responsibility and ownership of the project, prevents corruption and mismanagement, as I've mentioned, creates awareness and robust citizenry, and enriches policy content implementation and those outcomes. It improves intra communication, so in between within the community itself, and intercommunication with communities in the adjacency, puts people in charge of changing their lives. One of the most effective tools that you can use is empowering people to be agents to their own development. It establishes trust between stakeholders, government, the private sector, community groups, and it creates a more stable and productive development. We've now gone into active citizenry, and we'll pause here and start off the next one we'll start the next one in active citizenry, which is slide number 45, and then do another about 30 minutes or so. But for now, the reason I wanted to break this up is that even as you study and you go through the slide series, is to mark this off as a midpoint, and then we'll go to active citizenry and we'll close off unit 2 in the next in part 2 of this lecture series.